All right, let's jump right in. We're about to break down one of those moments in history that changed, well, absolutely everything. Europe's explosive leap across the Atlantic. This is a story of ambition, new tech, and consequences that didn't just alter the world map, it redrew the whole thing from scratch.
But it all really starts with one central question. In the late 1400s, the world for Europeans was a pretty small, contained place. So what happened? What was the spark that suddenly sent ships sailing off the edge of the known world? That's the mystery we're diving into.
To get to the bottom of it, we have to rewind the clock, back to a Europe that was pretty much at a boiling point. It was a continent that was feeling cramped, kind of bursting at the seams and looking outwards with this powerful new mix of desperation and curiosity.
And this is where it gets really interesting. This massive change wasn't sparked by a single event, not at all. It was a perfect storm, a powerful collision of four totally different forces all happening at the exact same moment.
So you really have to understand this potent cocktail of motives. First up, the money. The Ottoman Empire had a lock on all the land routes to get spices from the east, which meant prices for stuff like pepper were just sky high. Second, you've got some seriously game-changing tech. New ships like the Caravel and tools like the compass and astrolabe meant sailors could finally, for the first time, navigate the open ocean. Then there was a whole new mindset, humanism, which was all about digging up ancient knowledge and sparking this intense curiosity about what else was out there. And finally, you have pure political ambition. You've got these newly powerful unified monarchies in Spain and Portugal, and they are hungry for cash, for power, and for a way to one-up their rivals.
So, with all those pieces on the board, the race was on. The grand prize? Finding a direct sea route to the legendary riches of Asia. And the two main players, right next door to each other, were Portugal and Spain.
Now, Portugal's strategy here is fascinating. They played the long game. They were slow, careful, almost like a chess grandmaster. Led by Prince Henry the Navigator, they started inching their way down the coast of Africa, step by painful step. Then, a huge breakthrough. Bartholomew Das makes it around the treacherous tip, the Cape of Good Hope. And finally, Vasco da Gama finishes the job, landing in India and securing that priceless sea route. It was this patient approach that eventually led to the Magellan-Elcano expedition, circling the entire globe.
But hold on. Right at this moment, the story takes a wild turn. While Portugal's meticulously charting its path east, this Italian sailor, Christopher Columbus, shows up with a radical, almost crazy idea. To get to the east, why not just sail west?
The Portuguese, who'd actually done the homework and had the maps, told him his math was all wrong and basically laughed him out of the room. But Spain? Spain was a different story. The king and queen had just unified their kingdom, they were feeling powerful, ambitious, and they looked at Columbus's wild plan and pretty much said, you know what? We'll take that bet.
It's kind of incredible to think that this gamble, this voyage that would literally reshape human history, was a pretty tiny operation. We're talking just 3 small ships, a crew of about 90 guys, all sailing into a total blank spot on the map. And after 2 long, nerve-wracking months at sea, they finally spotted land.
And let's be really clear about something. This was not some romantic adventure for the sake of science. It was a business venture, plain and simple. Before he even set sail, Columbus signed a detailed contract with the Spanish crown. It's crucial, because it laid out the real motivation. It promised him fancy titles, power over any lands he found, and a 10% cut of all the gold and spices. The potential payday was enormous.
And this brings us to one of the biggest ironies in all of history. It's almost hard to believe. Columbus made 4 trips back and forth exploring all around the Caribbean, and he went to his grave completely 100% convinced he had found the outskirts of Asia. He never, ever realized he'd bumped into a whole new hemisphere.
So it actually took another guy, an explorer named Amerigo Vespucci, to sail along the coast a few years later and say, hey, wait a minute, this coastline is way too big. This isn't Asia. This is something else entirely, a new world. And in the ultimate twist, the new continents ended up being named America, after him, not Columbus.
So now, the global chessboard is just completely flipped over. You have 2 rival empires, Spain and Portugal, staring at this huge new chunk of land that's suddenly in play. And things got tense fast. So, how do you keep them from going to war over it? You find a referee.
So they called in the highest authority they knew, the Pope. And in a move of just stunning simplicity, he literally took out a map and drew a line right down the middle of the Atlantic. And boom, the Treaty of Tordesillas.
Everything to the west of the line belonged to Spain, everything to the east to Portugal. That single line shaped the future of empires, and believe it or not, it's the reason people in Brazil speak Portuguese today.
Okay, so now the story shifts from exploration to conquest, and this is where things take a much darker, more violent turn. The main characters aren't just navigators anymore. They're conquistadors, soldiers, adventurers, all driven by a thirst for gold and glory.
What happened next was just shockingly fast. And the central question that historians still debate is, how was this even possible? How on earth could a few hundred men bring down huge, sophisticated empires like the Aztecs in Mexico and the Incas in Peru?
Well, it came down to a few key factors. The conquistadors were master strategists. In Mexico, Hernán Cortés was brilliant at turning local groups who already hated the Aztecs into his allies. Plus, the Spanish showed up with terrifying advantages: steel armor, guns, and horses, which no one in the Americas had ever seen before. But their deadliest weapon, by far, was totally invisible: European diseases like smallpox, which just ripped through the native populations who had absolutely no immunity.
Once they were in control, the Spanish set up a system to get rich called the encomienda. Now, on paper, it sounded almost paternalistic. A Spanish colonist would protect and Christianize a group of native people, and in return, they'd provide labor. That was the theory. In practice, it was a nightmare, a thinly disguised system of brutal forced labor that led to a population collapse of unbelievable proportions.
But, it's important to remember that not everyone was okay with this. There was a friar, Bartolomé de las Casas, who saw the horror firsthand and wrote these scathing reports back to Spain. He basically said, let's be honest, the only reason we're doing this is for gold. His work actually did lead to new laws to protect people, but enforcing them from thousands of miles away was another matter entirely.
So let's zoom out now and look at the massive, long-term impact of all this. Because this collision of worlds didn't just create new colonies, it fundamentally rewired the entire planet.
The economic shockwave was just huge. I mean, just look at this number. This is the amount of silver, mostly from a single mountain mine in modern-day Bolivia called Potosí, that was shipped to Europe. Over 16,000 tons. The scale is just mind-blowing.
So what happens when you suddenly dump that much new money into an economy? You get the world's first ever global inflation crisis. It financed empires and paid for armies, yeah, but it also destabilized economies all across Europe. It was the world's first global economic shock.
So when the dust finally settles, what you have is a completely new global reality. Economically, you have the first real global trade networks connecting the Americas, Europe, and Asia. Politically, Spain had to invent a whole new system of government just to manage this massive overseas empire. And socially, well, the world was now connected, for better and for worse, in a way it had never been before. The first age of globalization had officially begun.
And this brings us to our final big thought. When you look back at this whole chain reaction, a desperate search for spices, a wild gamble sailing west, the fall of empires, a flood of silver, you have to ask a pretty fundamental question. Are we looking at the actual starting gun for the deeply interconnected, complex, globalized world that all of us live in today?